Hello, and welcome to Knowledge 10, Lesson 6. This is about George Washington, the Commander-in-Chief. Today you're going to learn about the contributions of George Washington to American history. And I want you to pay attention especially to the word struggle and struggled. We'll find out what it means to struggle. Okay? All right. Now, listen carefully about one of George Washington's most important jobs. He was the Commander-in-Chief of the new Army. You'll remember that while representatives to the Second Continental Congress met and signed the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, George Washington was far away from Philadelphia. He was sent north to Boston to fight the British. His was a very difficult job. Washington's army was made up mostly of farmers with no military experience at all. They had no uniforms. They had only old guns called muskets, which they hardly knew how to fire. There weren't enough guns, and there was hardly any gunpowder. The wording of the Declaration of Independence was approved on July 4th, 1776, and 5 days later, messengers carrying copies of the Declaration reached New York, where General Washington's army was camped. His army heard the words and rallied in support of independence. Yay! A statue of King George was melted down and into bullets. They melted a statue down and made bullets out of it, of the king, for the Continental Army. The men soon realized they would never have enough bullets for the fight ahead. Later that summer, British warships were seen entering New York City's harbor. King George had gotten help from the Germans as well. More than 30,000 troops with good training had arrived to fight the unprepared colonial militiamen. George Washington nearly lost his army in the fierce fighting around New York and New Jersey that fall. The Redcoats chased the Continental Army south across the Delaware River. Thinking that they had scared them off, the Redcoats left only a small force to guard them on the other side of the river. It was December, cold weather, and they felt sure that nobody would fight during the dead of winter. But they were wrong. George Washington came up with a daring plan. Daring means courageous. On Christmas night, he gathered his men together. It was snowing and cold, but Washington had the men get into their boats and row quietly across the ice-filled river. More than 2,000 soldiers crossed the Delaware River. The crossings took a few hours. Marching through the wind and the sleet of the December cold, the Continental Army reached the British troops just before the sun came up, just before dawn. While the Redcoats were still sleeping, Washington's men launched a surprise attack on the enemy camp. The Redcoats were surprised all right. Some of them came out of their bunks in their underpants and just held up their hands. It was a total victory for General Washington. Nobody in his army had been killed. Washington and his army returned to Philadelphia to shouts of joy. But the war wasn't over yet. The Continental Congress knew that they needed more help in order to win their war for independence. German soldiers were fighting alongside the British. Maybe the French would send soldiers across the ocean to help the colonists fight against the British. It was no secret that the French and the British had long been enemies. They fought several wars between each other. And the Continental Congress decided to send some men to France to ask for their help. Their chief representative was the 70-year-old Benjamin Franklin. Remember who he was? The French did not like to lose in battle, and they were still angry about losing to the British in an earlier war. That earlier war, by the way, was the French and Indian War. That's what the Fort Crown Point and Fort Ticonderoga were built for, by the way. But at first they didn't want to support the colonists. It was crazy to think that an army of farmers could defeat one of the greatest armies in the world, the British Army. But an American victory in New York in the fall of 1777, down at Saratoga, changed their opinion overnight. They promised gunpowder, soldiers, and ships, so France was going to help. General Washington's army was camped in Pennsylvania at a place called Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 and 1778. Snow lay on the ground when Washington and his men arrived. They pitched tents. Now imagine pitching a tent when there's snow on the ground. And built log cabins, but neither one kept out the cold. The men were dressed in rags, and many of them had no shoes, walking barefoot in the snow. There was hardly any food, and some days the men had little to eat and drink other than bread and water. Disease spread through the camp, and many men died. The men missed their families and wanted to go home. Washington struggled to keep up his men's spirits. He camped in a tent beside them for a time, earning their respect. No battles were fought at Valley Forge that winter, but the cold and hungry men spent hours training to be ready when they met the British again in the spring. I just want you to think about what that must have been like. They were thousands of men camping in tents and living in log huts in the snow. And all the trees had been cut down for miles around. There was nothing to use for heat. They had to huddle in their blankets most of the time when they weren't out training. That, believe me, that took some kind of dedication. So remember Valley Forge and how brave those people were. Okay, a few things I want you to remember from this, and that is George Washington's army had no experience, and they had very few supplies. That means what do you expect an army to have? Boots and uniforms and guns, right? Well, some of them didn't have any boots. Some of them didn't have any guns. And they had no training. They were just a bunch of people called together. But think about, why were they so willing to fight the Redcoats? Yeah, they must really have wanted to be independent, right? And remember what happened on Christmas Day in 1776? That was when George Washington and his men rowed across the Delaware River and launched a surprise attack on the British, and that was a victory. So remember those things. Anyway, in the read aloud you heard, Washington struggled to keep up his men's spirits. Say that word, struggled, with me. Say that word, struggled. Struggled means had difficulty and worked very hard to accomplish something. Like, I struggled to get up the steps with the heavy box. Have you ever struggled with a math paper, maybe? Or struggled to read a story? Have you ever struggled to get out of bed in the morning? Or struggled with cleaning your room? Or struggled to find something? Yeah. Try to use that word struggled today, okay? Mom, I struggled to get my work done. All right. That's it for today. I hope you remember some things about the great George Washington, our Commander-in-Chief.